This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with author Paul Thomas Murphy about his new book, Falling Rocket, James Whistler, John Ruskin, and the Battle for Modern Art. The subject of the book is a landmark libel suit from 1878 that pitted the artist Whistler versus the most authoritative art critic of his time. Ruskin had taken issue with a number of groundbreaking Whistler paintings which captured London by night, claiming them devoid of artistic merit and Whistler a fraud. The book illuminates the decade leading up to the trial, the events of the litigation, and the aftermath of the jury's judgment. And now, a discussion about the defense of modern art with author Paul Thomas Murphy. Paul Thomas Murphy, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Paul, you have written a new book, Falling Rocket, James Whistler, John Ruskin, and the Battle for Modern Art. I just completed reading the book and would love to talk to you about this chapter in the history of art that I'm ashamed to say that I didn't know enough about. So for that person that you run into at the dinner party and they say, oh, you just wrote a book, how would you start to describe the seeds of this story?
Well, all the books I've written about deal with cultural conflict in the 19th century with kind of a sweet spot around the 1870s. And barely after the last one, I was sort of rooting around for a new one. And this is, to my mind, sort of the most striking episode of high cultural conflict in the 19th century. Had quite a bit of familiarity with Ruskin, and it led me to getting just as familiar with Whistler. And where I really fell in love with it was getting to know both of them more as I was researching them. They're the two hugest egos in the 19th century, first of all. And the thing that really, actually helped and created some work was that they left an amazing record of themselves, both of them. I mean, in their writings, Whistler through his correspondence, which is voluminous and really telling. And Ruskin, of course, he has his own sort of personal documents, but also through all of his writing, which is voluminous, doesn't even begin to to describe that. And so it led me down to really to look at it all and learned a lot more about him too. So it was really the characters that created the story for me and really kept me interested in it.
Your book really kind of takes part in three acts: the world leading up to the trial itself, and then the aftermath, for lack of a better word. But we spend, the first third of the book really getting to know these two central characters, Whistler and Ruskin, and how they are extremely eccentric characters in drastically different ways, right? I mean, they could not be more diametrically opposed in some ways, but in some ways they are driven by ego.
Absolutely. I mean, they both, more than any two figures of the time, they thought they knew art. I mean, they thought they were the masters, the arbiter of art, in Ruskin's case as a critic, and Whistler as the great as the artist, capital A. And when he, after the trial, began to sort of give speeches and sort of, really began to sell himself as an artist, he presented himself, actually within days of the trial, as the artist, distinct from all others. So they did have that sort of sense that they were right. They were right. And that's what makes actually the trial so interesting, because it was kind of like going to the public and going to the law to decide who was right. Even though Ruskin, in the end, as you know, didn't actually sit there in the trial, he wasn't there. He did his best to through surrogates, through his pushing his lawyers in certain ways to bring himself into that trial and to justify. Actually, I use that word carefully because it hinged upon proving himself absolutely right. The libel defense of justification. He tried to justify his view, and so did Whistler. So it was that huge clash that you could sort of see everything leading up to that, and then there was a trial, and then there was the aftermath, which I think is also incredibly important. It's not just here's what happened to them afterwards; it's here's how the battle continued.
It would probably be good to frame for the listener what Whistler's work consisted of. I think for a certain number of people, they may not know more than the mother painting.
Yes.
But it's very interesting that what we see is Whistler is, he portrays himself as having a lot of confidence about his work, but he winds up exploring kind of two different bodies of work that I think he himself struggles with. Because one is based on being very free and loose and everything we think of in terms of contemporary art today. But then there are the commissions and the portraits where he is obsessive about perfectionism and almost wanting to stride alongside John Singer Sargent.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of give us some background about the particular body of work, how we get from Whistler's Mother to this particular painting that John Ruskin took so much umbrage with?
Yeah, in a way, actually, we get there very quickly, even though they're so incredibly different looking paintings. I mean, I start the book, I flash back after that, but start the book with the painting of the mother and his mother coming to England and setting that up. And there is sort of this sense that, I mean, this lingering sense that the mother was a sentimental painting. I mean, it's a good subject painting. It's his mother, but Whistler he never called it the mother. He called it the arrangement in gray and black #1, and it at the time that seemed incredibly affected to call it that. But he was deadly serious about it. He said, I love my mother, but you shouldn't care about my mother when you look at this picture. You should look at the arrangement. You should look at the formal elements of the picture. It is something that he's always tried to get people to do. It's something that others have tried to get people to do since then, but it's hard for people to do it. He was almost too successful in depicting his mother to say it's not a picture of something else. It's an entity to itself. It should be appreciated by itself. Anyway, he painted the mother in 1871, and at the same time he was painting the mother, he on impulse and according to his mother, with his mother's sort of encouragement, painted two paintings in August, I believe, 1871, and did them very, very quickly. As you said, he was always sort of in agony about getting the picture right and repainting it. He would scrape it down. He would drive his sitters nuts and often drive them away by repeatedly. I mean, spending days and days, weeks and months on the same paintings and never finishing a lot of them.
Sometimes years.
Years, absolutely, and sometimes years with no successful result. The mother he did actually fairly quickly, 2 or 3 months. He was done with that. And these two paintings, he did 2 of them in one night. And the second one is an important painting because it was his first London nocturne. He did sort of experiment with the form a few years before, but that was the first London one, and the first of many. Suddenly, he went wild painting these nocturnes, and those were again arrangements of form and color. and tone. I mean, some of them, including the one he painted that first night, are nearly monochromatic. What definition they have are definition that depend upon gradients of tone. Uh, uh, so it's that. Uh, Actually, it's interesting. The best summation of what he was doing is not from Whistler, which is amazing because he's usually the best person at telling people what he was doing, but from his first pupil, Walter Greaves, who with his brother was kind of Whistler's apprentice for a long time, including when he was painting this nocturne. And Greaves said of his and his brother's work, to us, a boat was always a boat. To Whistler, a boat was a tone. And that idea that he was really trying to see the beauty in things for themselves, not for their context, is what he was getting at in that painting. And actually, I would say also in the Mother, but here you can really see what he's doing. Anyway, that was 1871. 1875, he paints The Falling Rocket, which is this. I was going to say portrayal, but Whistler would be annoyed if I did. It was an evocation of Cremorne Gardens, which was a pleasure garden, sort of amusement area near where he lived in Chelsea. And he painted it. He was trying to capture it. He called his paintings for a while moonlights. But this one was not a moonlight. It had no. I mean, there was no. It was an attempt to capture a pitch black, dark night, and with a fireworks show going on. But the fireworks show provided some light, but didn't illuminate anything. And in the end, it was, as you can imagine, a baffling work to the people who saw it because. It didn't depict anything. It was you could make out some vague forms, but mostly it was a picture of the darkest night. Anyway, that painting, 1875, and it got its share of criticism before 2 years later John Ruskin saw the painting. But that's what set off this battle.
Those nocturnes, as you describe them, are amazing, and I can't remember exactly who took the stand at the trial and spoke to those paintings being, evocations of the air. Mm-hmm. He was accomplishing what he was setting out to do. You're trying to capture or communicate to someone something that's incredibly ephemeral, something that's, you can't quite touch, which does not sound crazy to us. Mm-hmm. In the 21st century, talking about art. But for someone who's the Slade professor of art history at Oxford, that whole notion seems like a lot of bunkus, given the fact that from the perspective of John Ruskin, a certain amount of the value of art was in the labor in making art and in the precision of what you execute. This is someone whose eye was trained in a world before photography. There was a big part of the goal of painting was to capture these things.
And to him, there is more than depiction going on, although that's important. He had no trouble with the idea of painting representing something and representing something well. He also had a highly moral outlook about art. I mean, all art. He was highly spiritual as opposed to religious. I mean, this idea that sort of everything has a moral nature infuses his ideas about art, infuses ideas about political economy and all the other disciplines. I mean, it basically sort of ties everything together. Ruskin's idea of art is that that the greatest artwork is the work with the most ideas. It says things. It has a context, and there's always that sort of filled with visual accuracy, but also spiritual energy. None of that meant anything to Whistler. and in fact, actually, when Ruskin saw the falling rocket, he was in a gallery. It was a gallery that just opened for the first time, and had sort of was the venue for the avant-garde, and therefore he found a lot, I think, to dislike there. But he found in Whistler the most to dislike, and he found in that painting the very most to dislike, because it was darkness, and to him that had a spiritual connotation, but a negative spiritual connotation, and it basically was a picture of nothing to him, and it had no ideas. It was missing this idea of this kind of removing or beginning to remove, and then with this painting taking it, removing it quite a bit from the image of the thing, the clearly defined depiction. It meant to him that this was a horrible painting, a frightening painting. So it really did represent everything he hated in this new modern art. Remember, the work that made him famous was called modern art, or modern artist, sorry. So he thought he had defined modern, and here's somebody else who's coming along and creating a modern idea that to him is anathema.
It seems that Ruskin almost worshipped Turner, but even that was problematic. Yes. for Ruskin, because Turner's work evolved over time from something that very much reflects everything you just described about Ruskin's moral attraction and the sources of light and representation. And Turner evolved into something that is incredibly contemporary and really very shadowy and amorphous. And Ruskin, I think he struggled with what to do with Turner's later work.
He did. Although when he was making his name with his first book, his 5 volumes on art, the impetus for that work was Turner. He went a lot further than that, but he began with Turner, and he began because critics of the time were attacking Turner in the same way that he later attacked Whistler. And some people found him to be a hypocrite in that. But I think that he saw Turner and Whistler as very different. You can certainly see similarities. And in fact, you said that I think it was Albert Moore on the stand saying that Whistler painted the air. Turner has been, praised for doing the same kind of a thing, by creating atmosphere and capturing atmosphere in the painting. But to Ruskin, the younger Ruskin, with Turner, he really had a sense that people just weren't seeing Turner right, that they were saying that Turner wasn't painting reality, and he was saying he was capturing it better than any other artist ever had. He does, for later volumes of modern artists, he goes back to medieval Renaissance painters, but at first he was trying to defend Turner, and the way he did it was by saying that Turner captures this better than any previous Renaissance medieval artist. The book, the thesis kind of shifted as he went on, but to him there was a distinct difference between Turner and Whistler. Turner had ideas. Turner captured nature in a way that Whistler, at least in Ruskin's mind, never could.
And I guess this all kind of comes to a head. Ruskin publishes a review in his own publication,
Horace Clapagera,
that basically he calls Whistler a cockney, a coxcomb, and basically questions how he can even call what he has put out there as art, and questions how someone could throw pots of paint at a canvas and ask 250 guineas for a piece, which I believe in today's dollars would be roughly like 140,000 pounds if I saw the calculation right. And Whistler seemed to be the type of person that was always ready for a fight, was always ready with a dueling pistol. And I'm not sure what he hoped to gain from the combative nature, but that results in him going to a lawyer to file suit in a libel case against Ruskin. And this episode is almost like a Miracle on 34th Street sort of trial, in that how do you prove whether or not an artist makes art? It's as difficult as trying to prove whether or not Kris Kringle is really Santa Claus, right?
Yeah, it was the absurdity of trial. His contemporaries, their contemporaries, knew that, and certainly Punch magazine sort of captured that after the trial. That it's insane, and also his friends pointed that out. I mean, when they had this kind of muddled verdict, which really left nothing answered and everything to answer. One of his friends said, well, this is what happens when you ask a jury of pastry cooks to answer a question like this. It can't happen. And yet, well, Whistler, I mean, Ruskin would have said, yes, it can, or you can answer questions about art because I know these answers, and I will tell you those answers. And he was aching to get on the stand to tell those answers. Whistler, I think, is a little bit different. I mean, he had a great belief in himself, and what he really hoped to achieve in the trial, I believe, is to get on the stand and not so much prove that his art was the only art, but prove himself as an artist, and to justify in that sense, in kind of different sense, his artistry, to declare his genius, if you want to put it that way. And in that, I think he felt he largely succeeded, and I think he did largely succeed. It didn't raise the value of his paintings. He didn't sell any more paintings. He had a lot more to do to prove that his art, to win over the art world to his art. And that's what he spent the rest of his career doing, and with greater and greater success. But he wanted to get the word out. Although I have to, he also wanted the money. He wanted £1,000. That's what he asked for, and he needed the money, obviously. But he wanted to, as he told his lawyer, to let Whistler, let me show the real Whistler here, and that's what he did.
I think he wanted to be on the stand and wanted to be quoted demonstrating his wit, right? Because I think he transacted in many ways on the rest of his life, or at least in his mind, on monetizing his wit, right? And he had a couple of memorable quotes on the stand, refuting the notion that I believe the question was like, how can you spend one day working on a painting and ask such an exorbitant price? And I believe the response was, well, it's a very contemporary artist sort of answer, like, well, it took me years to paint that painting in a day.
Yeah. The education of a lifetime basically went into that painting. And it is a very modern sense, and there's a lot of ways that Whistler at the time, he was not a Victorian, I don't think at all. He was sort of the prototypical modern artist, leaving what he did on canvas aside. He made himself. He made Whistler. He became a brand. When the trial was decided, he was one artist among many. Nobody really saw him as a great artist. By the time he died, he was preeminent. It took him longer in England than it did in Europe. America is kind of a little confusing as to how his reputation developed, but by the end, in all three places, he was considered to be a great artist on his own terms. And one way that he, sort of defended his artistry throughout his life was by spelling out those terms everywhere he could get, and conflict was one way to do it. He took on the critics. Ruskin was the big one, but there were a whole bunch of little ones that he was taking on at the same time, not so much before. At the same time, afterwards, he just never
Sure.
let up. He just never let up with the critics. Even the ones who, were turning towards him in a sense, he would never let them forget the stupid things they said
Sure.
about him. Every time he did that, and he did that, in letters to the press, he did that by collecting everything into a book that was a huge bestseller. Every time he did that, there was a sense that he was once again showing how his ideas about art triumphed over their stupid ideas about art.
Whistler seemed like someone who was constantly getting in his own way. And all the things that he accomplished in the end, it seems like he could have gotten to them decades earlier if he had been a more amenable person. Whether that is completing commissions, just doing what he said he would do, or not having falling outs with the Royal Academy, or not having falling outs with the U.S. Pavilion at the World Fair Expo in '89, or all of the all of these things. It just, it's almost as if he was his own worst enemy in some ways.
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, he didn't play the game, and in all kinds of ways he didn't work to support the system. He worked to sort of break it. And he did things like, that what he did with the Society of British Artists in the 1880s. He sort of got himself into it and then took it over completely. It was kind of a second cousin to the Royal Society, the Royal Academy. In that artists who couldn't get into that, and some who could, actually use it as a stepping stone. But he decided he was going to make it a stepping stone for Whistler, and pretty much only Whistler. And he got in there, um, uh, uh, pretty much immediately, sort of made enemies of half the people, and brought in his own supporters. Who would in turn support him, and turn shows not into sort of sales events, which they really were, but into showcases for his own work, and those that he had his supporters carefully select. They finally got rid of him, but in the end, he really did a great job of subverting that society to his own ends. I mean, that's I could, throughout his life, certainly after the trial, he was constantly involved in that kind of a thing, and constantly making enemies. I mean, making enemies became part of his brand. I mean, that was, and those who would support him, the critics, and did support him at times. He did his best to turn into to turn into his enemies. Again and again. However, in the end, it did, number one, isolate him from the mass of artists. It made him an individual, and it did signal to the world that his art was distinct and was unique. And he was, I don't know if by making enemies, he was going to prove to anybody that it was better or stronger, or it was going in the right direction as far as art goes. But in the end, he did largely convince the world that he was different, and he had quality. He was an artist. He was a great artist. It was an amazing story of somebody who basically did his best, it seems, to make the world his enemy, and in the end, made the world a believer in what he was doing. It was an incredible job, yes, and a strange one.
I think one of the interesting things that you lay out in the book is the contrast of Whistler and Ruskin in terms of their relationships with women. And, Whistler, maybe as a result of his hubris and his confidence and his narcissism, can be portrayed as a bit of a womanizer, right? Whereas Ruskin had very odd relationships with women. I believe in the last 4 or 5 years, there's even been a movie about his first marriage to Effie Gray. I mean, just the peculiarity of that relationship, and honestly, that relationship that was unconsummated over a decade probably isn't the weirdest relationship, over the arc of his life.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about the how those stories of those relationships kind of helps us understand who these two men were, in their own right?
Yeah, well, Whistler, if actually, I was going to say that Whistler, it kind of shows the power of his own ego in a sense that he did. He had long-standing affairs that were almost closer to marriages with two of his, well, I was going to say models, but they became everything for him. They became kind of agents. They became sort of housekeepers. They became lovers, of course. Actually, one of them became a kind of fellow artist too for a while. That he basically um, uh, had these relationships with these two women that kind of ended in each case sort of abruptly as he went from one to the next to the next. They were also, if you look at his artist portraits, two of the most famous models for his work. Whistler and his women. I mean, he was always actually, even going back to his Parisian days, he always seemed to have a mistress somewhere along the way, and he always made great use of those mistresses. They became sort of incredible assistants. They became kind of agents. They were great publicists. They did his housework. They did everything for him. And when he moved on from them, he really moved on. I mean, he was just basically done. He didn't make enemies of them, I think. In fact, the two women that were his mistresses before his wife, he had long-standing relationships, connections with even after they were gone. So he basically he tended to move from one woman to another, as he did with everything in his life. I mean, you'll notice that Whistler, he had a set of friends. 3 years later, no, they weren't there anymore. There was another one. There was another one. There was another one. It was a clear demonstration of his, I think, his sense of ultimate isolation from the world, his sense that he was alone in the way that he tended to use people throughout his life. And he did that with the women in his life too, with the exception perhaps of his wife, who he was devastated when she died of cancer. Uh, uh, and she had a kind of greater power over him, perhaps, than any other person in his life. So there was that. That was for Whistler. That was an unusual situation. They were a couple, and he was never in his entire life part of a couple before that. Um, uh, Ruskin obviously had never had what you would call a normal relationship with a woman, and was always, I mean, the Effie Gray situation. Yeah, there was that movie Effie Gray, which I have to admit I always have problems with the cinematic depictions of Ruskin because they always present him as it's so. There was a power to him that doesn't come across in any of those roles. But there was a weakness to him too that does come across in that movie, where Effie Gray, who later, who he married her. He went to Venice with her and did all of his measurements for the stones of Venice while he was married to her. and it very likely never consummated the marriage. And that's why the marriage ended in the end when Effie Ruskin at the time, just absolutely had enough, fled, left a letter for Ruskin's mother telling about all his failings. And a year later, married the painter Millet, and the two of them had a large family together, and very difficult marriage for both Ruskin and Effie Gray. And he always, I think, he had two other relationships, let's say relationships, with two other women. One was Rose Latouche, who he knew and met as a child and fell in love with before she was an adult. No, the evidence suggests anyway, no consummation there at all. But he always saw her as sort of the embodiment of a great spirit, and never, or at least never acted on anything physically there. I think that is it's kind of a dark side of his idea of seeing everything as spiritual. I mean, in this woman, he saw something that was only spiritual, and she was a highly spiritual, a highly religious young woman, and almost subject to a kind of religious mania. I mean, she was it seems anorexic. She was, her health, her religion was so strong that it affected her health, and she died young. And there is, that's one way to look at his relationship with Rose Latouche, is that it really shows his hypersensitivity to the spiritual and things. And we see a kind of a nightmare sequel to that much, much later in his life, towards the end of his rational life anyway, where he falls in love with a young woman, 20 years old, named Kathleen Olander, who he really thought was the second coming of Rose Latouche. In fact, had this kind of fantasy that the spirit of Rose Latouche sent this woman to him. That relationship just went nowhere, and went nowhere fast, as he started writing her letters. He thought he had proposed marriage to her and that she had somehow agreed to it, and she had no clue. And suddenly the letters, more and more, to anybody reading them, I have some passages from the book, from the letters. Anybody looking at those letters would know what he was talking about. She was naive and had no clue until he finally dropped the word wife. A person like me cannot live without a wife. Basically, he said, or I'll go insane. And that's when she figured it out, dropped all correspondence with him. Her parents made her do that, and that was the end of it for him. And soon afterwards, he did go insane, although it wasn't the first time and it wasn't the last time, but it was again. I mean, I suppose this kind of hyper spirituality, or this hypersensitivity to spirituality and need for it, and the real world intruding and led to that collapse.
In the book, you do a great job of documenting his slides in and out of these bouts of mental illness, which I don't know if we have enough details to really put some sort of psychological label on exactly what it was, but they appear to be immense bouts of depression brought on by some of the grief around Rose, and looking to try to see some sort of spiritual connection with, just hoping to hear some voice from the other side. And it seemed like the older he got, he would spend as much time debilitated as he would lucid. It's crazy to see this timeline of him going from basically an invalid in terms of bedridden and catatonic to 6 months or a year's time back giving lectures at Oxford, and then back to a catatonic state. It's an incredibly eccentric experience for a person to live through, right?
Yeah, and it is a process that's accelerated through time too. He went through that cycle, basically something like a dozen times in his life. And the first, well, actually, it's debatable as to whether the first real episode of this kind of at least temporary insanity occurred. You could argue that it was 1871 when Whistler painted his mother that year, when he did have a kind of a breakdown, which was physical, but it seems mental too. But most people would date the first one to just a few months before the trial, and it's why, in the end, he couldn't complete the trial. But it is. I'm glad you said that we may not have enough information to make a medical diagnosis, because a lot of people have, and I certainly did not even try. But there is, see, I mean, uh, it's. I mean, some have said it's sort of extreme bipolarity, and it could kind of fit that mold. But there was this kind of very much more of an emphasis on depression. But it was incredibly debilitating, and I argue in the book that the trial sort of brought out the issues, but it didn't resolve anything, and the resolution had to come with the rest of their lives. And both Whistler and Ruskin had something to prove after the trial. Whistler had to prove himself, had to prove his art. Ruskin had to regain his stature and reestablish himself as the arbiter of art, which I think by this time had really suffered a blow. And Whistler uh, Whistler largely succeeded in doing what he set out to do, even though, as you pointed out, at times he seemed to prove himself to be his worst enemy. Well, Ruskin really was a greater enemy to himself than Whistler ever was to him. Ruskin was all you could see. I mean, it's painful to witness. He would have these bouts of incredible, I mean, absolute collapse, mental collapse, hallucinations. I mean, the whole, he's basically felled by every one of these episodes and slowly crawls back. And on the advice of doctors, and also on, in his own mind, thought that one way to deal with this was not to deal with subjects that would excite him. And not to get into battles, basically, and that meant that a lot of the stuff that he was doing earlier on, the stuff that made his name, he just couldn't. He couldn't do it. And the problem, I guess, a problem for him is that he would, in the end, slowly start getting back into that kind of thing, and then the collapse would come again and again and again. And if what he was trying to do was to reestablish his authority, he absolutely failed. And in the end, and it took a while, but you certainly could see it coming for at a long distance. At the end, he was seen as a relic, as this empty shell, as this man of ideas who had no ideas anymore. And that's what his illnesses did to him.
We have 120, 130 years of space to pass judgment now. But as we look back, Ruskin's work, it's really left within the context of his time. Whereas, as an artist, from the artist's perspective, it really feels like Whistler, provided in those nocturnes, a turning point. Many of the same things that we talk about with the Impressionists, he was doing that, but it was a question of light versus, the dark. And his work is so contemporary, and it really gave people permission to do with contemporary art what happened over the course of the 20th century. And so in many ways, he won more than a farthing in the end, right?
He is, again. He's not a Victorian. He never saw himself as one. He always saw himself as something different. And he anticipates everything that was to come. I mean, he was the one that and did it most successfully with the falling rocket. He was the one that freed art from representation, from absolute representation. I mean, he was one of his problems with the Royal Academy was that they liked to tell stories with their pictures. He didn't tell stories with his pictures. He showed beauty. They existed in it was, to coin the term that best, not best, but very definitely describes his art. He was painting art for its own sake, not for, it wasn't a context to another text. It was a text in itself. So he was always aiming for the future. Ruskin, I agree largely that Ruskin was a creature of his own time, and actually, tragically, he was a creature whose time passed before he died. He was stuck in that past. He couldn't move on. I'd agree with that, except there are these on the fringes. There are ideas of Ruskin. I mean, the whole sort of environmental idea, and some may say it's part of his pathology, actually, but he was sensing that the world was changing environmentally. That in that respect, he was very definitely not a creature. He was ridiculed. When he wasn't ignored, he was ridiculed for that kind of a view. And in his political ideas too, his political economy, which I would argue was born of his ideas about art, but they too were ridiculed. And in fact, actually, he started turning to that around 1860, and that was the beginning of the end for him. This was before the trial. At that point, people were saying he knows about art, but he doesn't know about this stuff. And his reputation was already because he was insistent upon turning to that, and when people didn't believe him, yelling at them, and in print, getting angry at the world for not listening. He became a kind of, he was seen as a Victorian seer and a sort of Victorian prophet, and he became one of those angry prophets, basically, when it came to that, which nobody quite understood, but. I find a lot that's interesting, and a lot that most Victorians missed, and that sort of fringe view. But in terms of art, yes, it was Modern Artist was a book for its time, and had a kind of value for the pre-Raphaelites, and didn't really make it into the 20th century, just like he actually didn't just.
Well, Paul Thomas Murphy, thank you so much for engaging with me in a conversation about this wonderful book. You did a great job. There's so much detail, and you really paint a picture of who all of these characters were. And for anyone who loves art and art history, it's a wonderful read. The book is Falling Rocket, James Whistler, John Ruskin, and the Battle for Modern Art. I think you can get it just about anywhere you can buy a book these days. But Paul, I really appreciate you taking time to sit down and talk to me about this topic.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate you having me.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.